Over the skies of southern Germany, March 19, 1945, at 23,000 feet, First Lieutenant James Lawrence Carter of the 332nd Fighter Group watched 9 sleek enemy jets slice through the cloud layer ahead. The temperature outside his cockpit registered -30 degrees, and ice crystals formed delicate patterns on the edges of his canopy. His North American P-51 Mustang, nicknamed Sweet Caroline after his mother back in Tuskegee, Alabama, hummed with the steady rhythm of its Packard Merlin engine, producing 1,490 horsepower. At that moment, every tactical manual, every training protocol, every piece of conventional wisdom told him the same thing. Break off, dive away, use superior speed to escape. Jets were untouchable. Everyone knew that. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What Lieutenant Carter was about to demonstrate would rewrite the assumptions about aerial combat, prove that innovation could triumph over technology, and reveal how one man's unconventional thinking would protect an entire bomber formation while challenging every expert's understanding of what was possible in the air. James Lawrence Carter had learned to fly in conditions most pilots would consider impossible. Growing up in rural Alabama during the 1920s and 30s, he'd watched crop dusters work the cotton fields near his family's small farm. While other children played baseball or fished in the creek, young James spent hours studying how those fragile biplanes moved through turbulent air, how pilots compensated for crosswinds, how they seemed to make their aircraft dance. His father, a World War I veteran who'd served in a labor battalion in France, had told him stories about observation balloons and the strange new machines called aeroplanes. Those stories planted seeds that grew into obsession. By the time James turned 18 in 1941, the world had changed. The Army Air Corps, under pressure and necessity, had begun training colored pilots at a segregated facility in Tuskegee, Alabama. James had walked 37 miles to the recruitment office in Montgomery, his worn shoes developing holes by the time he arrived. The recruiting sergeant, a heavy-set white man with tobacco-stained teeth, had looked him up and down with barely concealed skepticism. "You really think you can fly, boy?" the sergeant had asked. James had met his eyes steadily and replied, "Sir, I've been flying in my mind since I was 6 years old. Now I'd like to do it for real." The training at Tuskegee proved more rigorous than anything James had imagined. The instructors, both the civilian pilots and the military officers overseeing the program, held the cadets to standards even higher than those applied to white pilots. They had something to prove, not just for themselves, but for every colored person in America who'd been told they weren't smart enough, weren't capable enough, weren't brave enough. Captain Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., the commander of the 99th Fighter Squadron, had addressed James's class during their first week. "You will be tested every day," Davis had said, his voice carrying the weight of certainty. "You will be doubted, dismissed, and underestimated. But you will also be excellent. Excellence is not optional here. It is the minimum requirement." James had absorbed every lesson, memorized every manual, practiced every maneuver until his hands moved by instinct. But he'd also developed something his instructors hadn't expected, a willingness to question conventional wisdom. During advanced training in early 1943, he'd discovered something strange during a practice stall. The Curtiss P-40 Warhawk he was flying had shuddered and dropped, exactly as expected. But in that moment of near uncontrolled flight, James had felt the aircraft respond to his inputs differently, more directly, as if the usual aerodynamic rules had temporarily suspended. He'd practiced the maneuver in secret, away from official training flights, learning to control what other pilots simply tried to avoid. His instructor, Captain Marcus Williams, a stern man from Philadelphia with over 2,000 hours of flight time, had caught him practicing unusual stall recoveries one afternoon. Williams had landed his own aircraft and walked over to James with an expression that promised serious consequences. "Lieutenant Carter," Williams had said, "what exactly do you think you're doing up there?" James had stood at attention, weighing honesty against self-preservation. "Sir, I'm exploring the edge of the flight envelope," he'd finally answered. "I think there might be tactical applications for controlled stall manipulation." Williams had stared at him for a long moment, then surprised James completely. "Show me," the captain had said simply. Over the next 3 months, James and Captain Williams had developed what they privately called the falling leaf maneuver. By deliberately entering a controlled stall, a pilot could briefly achieve a turn radius physically impossible during normal flight. The aircraft would essentially pivot around its center of gravity rather than following a traditional arc. The technique was dangerous, required split-second timing, and violated every standard engagement doctrine. But it worked. Williams had written a report to his superiors recommending the technique be studied and possibly incorporated into advanced training. The report had been filed away and forgotten. Unconventional tactics from colored pilots at a segregated training facility weren't exactly prioritized by the higher command structure. James had deployed to Italy with the 332nd Fighter Group in January 1944. The group, nicknamed the Red Tails for the distinctive red paint on their aircraft's tail sections, had been assigned to bomber escort duty. Their mission was simple in concept, but brutally difficult in execution: protect the heavy bombers of the 15th Air Force as they struck targets deep in enemy territory. The large 4-engine bombers, Boeing B-17 Flying Fortresses and consolidated B-24 Liberators, were vulnerable despite their heavy defensive armament. Enemy fighters could tear them apart if given the opportunity. The Red Tails had earned a reputation for never losing a bomber under their protection, a record they guarded fiercely. The spring of 1945 brought new challenges. Germany's conventional fighter force was diminishing, worn down by constant attrition and fuel shortages. But the German military had introduced jet-powered fighters that were faster than anything the Allies could field. The Messerschmitt, Me-262, powered by two Junkers Jumo 004 turbojet engines, could reach speeds of over 540 miles each hour. Allied piston-engine fighters like James's Mustang topped out around 440 miles each hour in level flight. The jets could choose when to engage and when to break off. They held every advantage except one: numbers. Germany's industrial capacity, battered by years of sustained attacks, could produce only a limited number of these advanced aircraft. On the morning of March 19th, James had attended the pre-mission briefing in a drafty Quonset hut at Ramitelli Airfield in southern Italy. Colonel William Mortimer, the mission commander, had outlined the day's objective with his usual precision. Gentlemen, Mortimer had begun, standing before a large map of southern Germany marked with colored pins and string routes. Today we're escorting 36 B-17 bombers from the 99th Bomb Group to strike an industrial complex near Munich. Intelligence suggests significant enemy activity in the area. The German armed forces during the war are throwing everything they have left at our bomber formations, including their new jets. We've seen increased jet activity over the past 2 weeks, and we expect them today. James had studied the map carefully, noting the route, the turning points, the expected fuel consumption and the location of emergency landing fields. His wingman, Second Lieutenant Robert Bobby Washington from Detroit, Michigan, had sat beside him taking notes. Bobby was 22 years old, with a quick smile and even quicker reflexes. He'd joined the squadron 6 months earlier and had rapidly proven himself a capable pilot. "You think we'll see the jets today?" Bobby had whispered. James had nodded slowly. "Weather's clear. Visibility's good. They'll come. They always do when the conditions are right for them." The briefing had continued with meteorological information, radio frequencies, authentication codes, and emergency procedures. Major Gregory Thompson, the squadron operations officer, had concluded with a reminder that struck James as particularly relevant. "Remember," Thompson had said, "if you encounter jets, do not try to dogfight them in a conventional turning engagement. They're too fast. Your best option is to use dive speed and work in pairs to create difficult deflection shots for them. Avoid prolonged engagement." The Major's advice was sound, based on accumulated experience and after-action reports. But James had felt a quiet conviction that there might be other options, unconventional options, if circumstances demanded them. The flight to the target area had been routine: 36 bombers in combat box formation, surrounded by a protective screen of 52 P-51 Mustang fighters. James's flight of 4 aircraft held position at 23,000 feet, above and slightly behind the bomber formation's right flank. The Alps passed below them, spectacular and indifferent, their snow-covered peaks glowing in the morning sun. Radio chatter was minimal, limited to necessary position reports and weather updates. The bomber crews, packed into their cold and cramped stations, focused on maintaining formation and watching for threats. At 10:47 hours, approximately 40 miles from the target, the first warning crackled through James's headset. Bandits, bandits. High 6 o'clock, coming fast. The warning came from Captain Ronald Mitchell, leading a flight positioned higher and farther back. James craned his neck, searching the sky behind and above. For a moment, he saw nothing, just empty blue sky and distant contrails. Then they appeared, 9 aircraft in loose formation, dropping through 28,000 feet and accelerating. Even from a distance, their silhouettes were distinctive, the swept-back wings, the streamlined fuselages, the absence of propellers. Jets, Messerschmitt, Me-262 fighters, nicknamed Sturmvogel or Stormbird by their pilots. Each aircraft carried 4 30mm cannons concentrated in the nose, devastating weapons that could tear a bomber apart with a single accurate burst. Captain Mitchell's voice came again, steady but urgent. Red 3 flight, vector right, engage bandits. Blue 1 flight, maintain escort position. Red tails, remember the mission. The bombers come first. James acknowledged the order and smoothly banked right, his flight of 4 Mustangs turning to intercept. Bobby's aircraft held position off James's right wing, exactly where it should be. The 2 other pilots in the flight, Lieutenant Samuel Jackson from New Orleans and Lieutenant David Martinez from Los Angeles, formed the second element behind them. The jets split into 3 groups as they approached. 3 aircraft continued toward the bombers, diving at tremendous speed. 4 jets swung wide, clearly planning to engage the escort fighters and create an opening. The remaining 2 aircraft maintained altitude, probably serving as top cover. James made a rapid calculation based on speed, angle, and distance. The 4 jets swinging wide would reach engagement range in approximately 45 seconds. His Mustang couldn't outrun them, couldn't climb as fast as them, and couldn't match their acceleration. But he could turn inside them. Probably. Maybe. If he was willing to risk everything on an unconventional maneuver that most pilots would call suicidal. Red 3 leader to flight, James transmitted, keeping his voice calm. Stay with me and watch for my break. We're going to give them a turning fight they're not expecting. Bobby's response came immediately. 3-2, Roger, right with you, boss. Jackson and Martinez acknowledged as well. The jets were closing fast now, growing from distant specks to recognizable shapes. James could see the smoke from their engines, the dark paint schemes, the purposeful geometry of weapons designed for a new kind of aerial warfare. The lead jet opened engagement at 800 yards, far outside effective range for conventional fighters. James saw the tracers first, bright streams of light that seemed to float before accelerating past his canopy. The distinctive sound of the jet's cannons carried across the sky, a rapid hammering that spoke of destructive power. James didn't flinch, didn't break. He held his course, watching the geometry of the engagement develop. The jet pilot was good, experienced, probably a veteran of dozens of missions. But he was used to opponents who ran, who dove away, who tried to escape rather than engage. At 500 yards, James initiated his maneuver. He pulled back on the stick firmly, while simultaneously reducing power and raising his nose above the horizon. The Mustang's speed bled away rapidly. His airspeed indicator unwound from 310 miles per hour toward stall speed. The aircraft began to shudder. Buffeting warnings transmitted through the control surfaces. The jet pilot, committed to his high-speed attack run, couldn't adjust quickly enough. He flashed past, missing by 300 feet, his speed carrying him beyond any chance of a quick return engagement. Now James executed the critical part of the maneuver. As his Mustang approached stall speed, he kicked hard left rudder while maintaining back pressure on the stick and rolling into the direction of the skid. The aircraft didn't turn in a normal sense. It pivoted, swapping ends violently, the nose sweeping through an impossibly tight arc. For a fraction of a second, the Mustang hung nearly motionless, suspended in defiance of conventional aerodynamics. Then James added power and pushed the nose down, trading altitude for speed, recovering from the stall in a direction 90 degrees different from where he'd started. The entire maneuver had taken perhaps 3 seconds. Bobby's voice came through the headset, amazed and alarmed simultaneously. "Boss, what the hell was that?" But there was no time for explanation. 2 more jets were already positioning for their attack runs. James's unconventional turn had brought him inside their attack formation, scattered their approach, and forced them to reconsider their tactics. Jackson's aircraft was engaging 1 jet at maximum range, his .650 caliber machine guns creating a web of tracers that forced the enemy pilot into a defensive break. Martinez was climbing hard, trying to reach the 2 jets holding high cover. James selected his next target, a jet that was attempting to swing around for another pass at the bombers. The enemy pilot was turning at high speed, confident in his aircraft's superior performance. James entered another controlled stall, this time from a slightly different angle and altitude. The Mustang pivoted again, that strange falling leaf rotation that broke every rule of energy management, but created angles of attack impossible through conventional maneuvering. He lined up for a deflection shot as he recovered, his gunsight pipper tracking ahead of the jet's nose. At 300 yards, he pressed the trigger. 6 streams of .50 caliber machine gun fire converged on a point in space where the jet would be in a fraction of a second. The timing had to be perfect. Too early, and the bullets would pass behind the target. Too late, and the jet would be gone, accelerating beyond reach. James's bullet struck the jet's left wing root and engine nacelle. He saw flashes of impact, pieces of metal torn away, smoke beginning to trail from the damaged engine. The jet pilot reacted immediately, rolling inverted and diving away, leaving the engagement. 1 down, not terminated, but out of the fight. Bobby was calling warnings now, his voice tight with stress. 3 more on our 6, coming hard. James pulled up and right, scanning for the threats. 3 jets in close formation, diving from 25,000 feet, their combined firepower enough to obliterate anything in their path. The bomber formation was still 4 miles away, maintaining course toward the target. The remaining escort fighters were engaged with other enemy aircraft. For the next 30 seconds, James's flight was on its own. Samuel Jackson's calm voice cut through the radio chatter. 3-3. I've got the right one. James appreciated Jackson's cool composure. The young pilot from New Orleans had steady nerves and excellent gunnery skills. That left the center and left jets for James and Bobby. James made his decision instantly. "Bobby, take the left one on my mark. I've got center." Martinez, break left and support Jackson. Acknowledged all around. The discipline of training held even in chaos. The jets were in range now, all 3 firing simultaneously. The sky filled with tracer rounds and cannon shells. James jinked right, then left, then initiated another stall turn. This one was tighter, more aggressive, pushing the edge of what his Mustang could handle. The airframe groaned, stressed beyond normal operational limits. The stall happened faster this time, the pivot more violent. James felt the seat harness bite into his shoulders as G-forces yanked him around, his vision grayed at the edges, blood draining from his head. But the maneuver worked. He rotated inside the jet's turn radius, briefly achieving a position directly behind and below the center enemy aircraft. The jet pilot saw him somehow, despite the impossible geometry of the situation. The enemy aircraft rolled hard right and pulled up, trying to use superior speed and climb rate to escape. But James had anticipated that reaction. He'd already started tracking upward, leading the target, calculating deflection based on hours of practice and instinct. He fired a sustained burst, walking his tracers into the jet's fuselage. Hits sparkled along the enemy aircraft's spine. The jet shuddered, trailing heavier smoke now, and continued its climb, but slower, damaged, losing the performance advantage that made it so dangerous. Meanwhile, Bobby had engaged his target with the determination of a pilot who trusted his leader completely. Bobby had seen James's stall-turn maneuvers now, understood the concept if not the execution. Bobby couldn't replicate the technique, not without practice and preparation, but he could use it as a distraction. While the jet pilot on the left was focused on James's aircraft, marveling or confused by the unconventional maneuvering, Bobby had closed to point-blank range and delivered a decisive burst. The jet's canopy shattered, the aircraft rolling out of control, the pilot bailing out, his parachute blooming white against the dark sky. Jackson reported success as well. 3-3, Splash 1. Bandit is going down. James saw the smoke trail, saw the tumbling aircraft, saw confirmation that one more threat had been eliminated. That made 2 jets out of action, possibly 3 counting the damaged aircraft James had hit earlier. But 6 remained, and they were adapting to the new tactics. The enemy pilots were professional, experienced, capable of learning and adjusting. They'd seen what James could do. They wouldn't be surprised twice. The next phase of the engagement became a chaotic ballet of speed, position, and timing. The remaining jets split up, refusing to be drawn into turning fights where James could use his unconventional advantage. They made slashing attacks, firing from long range, then using superior speed to disengage before the Mustangs could respond. It was the correct tactical doctrine for jets facing piston-engine fighters. It minimized risk while maintaining offensive pressure. The bomber formation was getting closer now, only 2 miles away. The jets were running out of time to break through the escort screen. James's fuel gauge showed 640 gallons remaining, enough for continued engagement and return to base, but not enough for extended combat at full power. He'd burned fuel heavily during the aggressive maneuvering, each stall turn costing precious gallons. Bobby's aircraft had sustained minor damage, a few holes in the left wing that didn't affect performance, but served as a reminder of how close they were to disaster. Martinez had used most of his ammunition engaging multiple targets. Jackson was reporting hydraulic issues, reducing his aircraft's maneuverability. Then the situation changed again. The 2 jets that had been holding high cover suddenly dove, joining their companions in a coordinated attack on the bomber formation. All 6 remaining jets were now committed, converging from different angles, timing their runs to saturate the defensive fire. The bomber gunners opened up with their .50 caliber machine guns, creating a cone of fire that the jets had to penetrate. Several escort flights maneuvered to intercept, but the geometry favored the attackers. The jets were simply too fast, approaching from too many directions simultaneously. James saw the danger developing and made a split-second decision that contradicted every lesson about fuel management and ammunition conservation. Red 3 flight, full power, converge on bomber formation. Do not let those jets through. He pushed his throttle to maximum, feeling the Merlin engine respond with a surge of power. His Mustang accelerated, closing the gap to the bombers. Bobby stayed with him, flying formation as if they were joined by invisible cables. Jackson and Martinez followed, their aircraft slightly behind but committed to the attack. The first jet made its run on the bomber formation, targeting a B-17 in the high right position. The bomber was Liberty Bell, piloted by Captain Frank Morrison from Iowa. James knew Morrison slightly, had played cards with him twice at the officers' club. Morrison's wife was expecting their first child in April. James intercepted the jet's attack vector, placing his Mustang between the attacker and the bomber. He fired his remaining ammunition in a long burst, not expecting to hit, but forcing the jet pilot to adjust his aim, spoiling the attack run. The jet's cannons fired, but the rounds passed behind Liberty Bell, missing by 20 feet. The bomber continued flying undamaged, its crew unaware how close they'd come to being torn apart. Another jet was coming in from the left, targeting the formation's lead aircraft. James attempted another stall turn, but his ammunition was exhausted and his fuel was critically low. He couldn't afford the fuel consumption of another aggressive maneuver. Instead, he simply placed his Mustang in the jet's path, offering himself as a target to protect the bombers. The jet pilot recognized the tactic and broke off, unwilling to risk collision. These enemy pilots were skilled and aggressive, but they weren't suicidal. Bobby's voice came through the headset, strained but steady. "Boss, I'm Winchester on ammo, and I've got maybe 20 minutes of fuel remaining. We need to break off." James knew Bobby was right. They'd done what they could. The bomber formation was approaching the initial point for their bombing run. Other escort flights were arriving to fill the defensive screen. The jets, having failed to break through and having spent most of their limited fuel reserves, began to disengage. One by one they broke off and accelerated away, heading back to their bases before their fuel ran out completely. James counted aircraft as they withdrew. 6 jets leaving the engagement area. That meant 3 had been taken out of action by his flight alone. 3 jets damaged or driven off from a force of 9, and not a single bomber lost. The cost had been high, though. Jackson was trailing smoke from his engine, reporting that he needed to land immediately. Martinez's hydraulic system had failed completely, meaning his landing would be difficult and dangerous. Bobby's aircraft had more damage than initially apparent, including a jammed aileron that would make flying treacherous, and James's own Mustang had been pushed beyond normal operational limits, stressed in ways the engineers back in Burbank, California, never intended. The flight back to Ramitelli Airfield was tense and careful. Jackson made an emergency landing at an Allied field in northern Italy, his engine finally giving out as he touched down. Martinez managed to bring his damaged Mustang home, but ground looped on landing when his hydraulic system's failure prevented him from controlling the tailwheel. He walked away unhurt, which was the important thing. Bobby landed with James talking him through every step, compensating for the jammed aileron with rudder and power adjustments. The landing was rough but successful. James's own landing was anticlimactic after everything else. His Mustang touched down smoothly, rolled out normally, and taxied to the parking area where ground crews waited. As he shut down the engine and the propeller windmilled to a stop, James felt the exhaustion hit him. His hands were shaking slightly, delayed reaction to the adrenaline and stress. He'd been in combat for 43 minutes, though it felt simultaneously like hours and seconds. He'd performed 9 separate stall-turn maneuvers, each one a controlled dance with disaster. He'd expended all his ammunition and burned through fuel at a rate that would have grounded him on any training flight. But the bombers had gotten through, every single one. That was what mattered. Colonel Mortimer was waiting when James climbed down from his cockpit. The colonel's face was serious, unreadable. "Lieutenant Carter," Mortimer said, "I need you to explain exactly what happened up there. Your combat camera footage shows maneuvers I've never seen before. Several pilots are reporting that you deliberately stalled your aircraft multiple times during active engagement. That's either brilliant or insane, and I need to know which." James had taken a deep breath, organizing his thoughts. "Sir, with respect, it's both. Let me explain. The debriefing lasted 3 hours. James described the stall-turn technique in detail, its development during training, its theoretical basis in aerodynamics, and its practical application against jets. He explained how the maneuver worked by temporarily breaking the aircraft's normal relationship between speed and turn radius. During a conventional turn, an aircraft's performance is limited by velocity and wing loading. But in a controlled stall, those limitations temporarily change. The aircraft pivots around its center of gravity instead of following a sustained arc. The turn radius becomes impossibly tight for that brief moment, allowing position changes that would be impossible otherwise. Captain Williams, James's old instructor from Tuskegee, happened to be visiting Ramitelli for a liaison meeting. Williams sat in on the debriefing and provided context about the technique's development. "I told them about this almost 2 years ago," Williams explained to Colonel Mortimer. "I wrote a full report recommending it be studied and incorporated into advanced training. The report was filed and forgotten." Williams's tone carried just a hint of bitterness. "Now we're seeing why it should have been taken seriously. This technique gives our pilots an edge against enemy jets, not a guaranteed advantage, but an edge." Mortimer had listened carefully, asked pointed questions, and finally nodded slowly. "Gentlemen," the colonel had said, "what I'm hearing is that Lieutenant Carter used an unconventional but theoretically sound technique to achieve a tactically decisive outcome. He drove off 9 enemy jets, protected the bomber formation, and brought most of his flight home safely. That sounds like exactly the kind of initiative and innovation we need. Lieutenant Carter, effective immediately. You're going to teach this technique to every pilot in the group. Captain Williams, I want you to stay and help develop a training program, and someone get me a connection to 15th Air Force headquarters. They need to know about this." Over the next 6 weeks, James trained 47 pilots in the controlled stall-turn technique. Not all of them could master it. The maneuver required precise timing, good spatial awareness, and willingness to embrace a moment of controlled chaos. About 60% of the pilots learned to execute the basic maneuver safely. About 30% could use it effectively in simulated combat. A small number, perhaps 10%, could employ it with the same instinctive confidence James had developed. But even teaching it to a minority of pilots changed the tactical equation. The technique spread to other fighter groups, refined and adapted for different aircraft types. By April 1945, dozens of Allied pilots were using variations of the stall turn to engage enemy jets more effectively. The German pilots noticed. Intelligence reports captured after the war included references to Allied fighters employing unorthodox and unpredictable maneuvers that complicated jet attacks. One captured Luftwaffe pilot, interrogated in May 1945, described engaging American fighters that seemed to stop in mid-air and pivot like dancers. The pilot had added with grudging respect that it made them very difficult targets despite our technical superiority. The psychological impact was significant. The jets still held advantages in speed and climb rate, but they no longer held complete superiority. Allied fighters could contest airspace more effectively, protect bombers more reliably, and impose costs on enemy jet operations. James flew 17 more combat missions before the war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. He encountered jets on 4 of those missions and successfully employed the stall turn technique on each occasion. His final tally included 3 jets driven off or damaged, making him one of the few piston-engine fighter pilots to repeatedly engage and defeat jet aircraft. He never claimed more than that, never inflated his achievements, never sought glory beyond the satisfaction of a job well done. The mission came first. The bombers came first. Personal recognition was secondary. After the war ended, James returned to the United States with the rest of the 332nd Fighter Group. They arrived in New York Harbor on July 2, 1945, aboard a converted Liberty ship. The city was celebrating, preparing for the expected end of the war against Japan. But the reception for the returning colored pilots was muted, segregated, separate from the mainstream celebrations. They'd proven themselves in combat, accumulated exemplary service records, protected hundreds of bombers and thousands of bomber crewmen. None of that changed the social realities they returned to. James was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for his actions on March 19th. The citation read, in part, for extraordinary achievement while participating in aerial flight against the enemy. First Lieutenant James Lawrence Carter displayed exceptional skill and courage by employing innovative tactics to defend bomber formations against superior enemy aircraft. His actions resulted in the successful completion of the mission and the safe return of all bombers under his protection. The medal was presented in a small ceremony at Lockbourne Army Air Base in Ohio, attended by fellow pilots and a handful of officers. There was no press coverage, no public recognition, no acknowledgement in the mainstream newspapers that a black pilot had developed tactics that changed how the Army Air Forces engaged enemy jets. Captain Williams continued to advocate for the technique James had pioneered. Williams wrote articles for military aviation journals, gave presentations at training facilities, and eventually helped develop the official doctrine for engaging jet aircraft with piston-engine fighters. The doctrine included the controlled stall turn as an advanced technique for emergency situations. Williams made sure that James received proper credit in the technical literature, even if that credit never reached the general public. Years later, in his memoirs, Williams wrote, "Lieutenant Carter's innovation demonstrated something essential about aerial combat. Technological superiority can be countered by tactical innovation and personal courage. The better machine doesn't always win. Sometimes the better pilot does." James himself left the military in November 1946. The Army Air Forces was in the process of becoming the independent United States Air Force, and there were opportunities for career advancement. But James had other plans. He returned to Alabama and used the GI Bill to attend Tuskegee Institute, where he studied mechanical engineering. He earned his degree in 1950 and went to work for an aircraft company in California, designing flight control systems. His understanding of aerodynamics, particularly the behavior of aircraft at stall speeds, made him valuable in an industry that was rapidly advancing. Bobby Washington stayed in the military and had a distinguished career. He flew combat missions in Korea from 1950 to 1952, achieving ace status with 7 confirmed victories. He retired as a colonel in 1972 and always credited James with teaching him that innovation and courage mattered more than following conventional wisdom. In an interview many years later, Bobby said, "James showed us that rules are just guidelines. When you understand the principles behind the rules, you can adapt and improvise. That's what made him special." He understood flight at a level most pilots never reach. Samuel Jackson became a commercial pilot after the war, one of the first colored pilots hired by a major airline. He flew for 28 years and logged over 19,000 hours without incident. David Martinez returned to Los Angeles and became a flight instructor, teaching thousands of students, including many veterans, using GI Bill benefits. Both men remained friends with James throughout their lives, gathering periodically for reunions with other Red Tails pilots. They would tell stories, remember fallen comrades, and privately acknowledge what they'd accomplished when the country had doubted they could accomplish anything. The bomber crews James had protected mostly never knew his name. Captain Frank Morrison, the B-17 pilot, whose aircraft Liberty Bell had been saved by James's intervention, survived the war and returned to Iowa. Morrison had 4 children, all of whom grew up, married, and gave him grandchildren. He farmed corn and soybeans, served on the local school board, and lived to age 83. He never knew that a black fighter pilot named James Carter had placed himself between Morrison's aircraft and an enemy jet on March 19, 1945. Morrison was one of thousands of bomber crewmen whose lives were protected by the Red Tails, part of a statistical success that was never properly acknowledged or celebrated in its time. The full story of the Red Tails, including James Carter's innovations, remained largely unknown outside military aviation circles for decades. The pilots returned to a segregated country that simultaneously celebrated its victory in the global conflict and maintained systematic discrimination at home. Many of them faced difficulties finding employment despite their skills and service records. They encountered prejudice, discrimination, and the casual dismissal of their achievements. The narrative of the war that emerged in popular culture largely excluded their contributions, focusing instead on white combat units and commanders. It wasn't until the late 1980s and 1990s that historians and researchers began documenting the Red Tails' full record. Scholars examined mission reports, combat camera footage, and personal accounts. They discovered the statistical truth. The 332nd Fighter Group had one of the best records of any escort fighter group in the 15th Air Force. They'd lost bombers under their protection, but far fewer than average. Their pilots had shown exceptional skill, discipline, and dedication, and individuals like James Carter had contributed innovations that influenced tactical doctrine. James Carter rarely spoke about his wartime experiences publicly. He lived quietly, worked diligently, and raised a family in Southern California. He had 3 children, 2 daughters and a son, and emphasized education and excellence to all of them. His son followed him into engineering and eventually worked on aerospace projects, including satellite systems. His daughters both earned advanced degrees and pursued successful careers. James attended Red Tails reunions and maintained friendships with fellow veterans, but he didn't seek publicity or recognition. In 2003, at age 80, James was invited to speak at the Air Force Academy in Colorado about his experiences developing the controlled stall-turn technique. It was one of the few times he spoke publicly in detail about March 19, 1945. The cadets listened with rapt attention as James, using a model aircraft and his hands to demonstrate, explained the aerodynamics and execution of the maneuver. He emphasized that the technique wasn't magic, wasn't supernatural, but rather a practical application of physics and a willingness to operate at the edge of the flight envelope. One cadet, a young woman from Texas, asked James if he'd been afraid during the engagement. James had considered the question carefully before answering. "Of course I was afraid," he'd said. "Fear is natural and appropriate when you're doing something dangerous. But I also had a job to do. Those bombers were filled with men depending on us. The crews back at base were depending on us. Everyone who trained us and believed in us was depending on us. Fear doesn't go away in situations like that. You just don't let it control your decisions. You acknowledge it, and then you do what needs to be done anyway." Another cadet asked if James felt bitter about the lack of recognition he'd received. James had shaken his head slowly. "I didn't do it for recognition," he'd explained. "I did it because it needed to be done and I had the skills to do it. Would it have been nice to be properly acknowledged at the time? Sure. Would it have been fair if the Red Tails had received the same level of recognition and opportunity as white combat units? Absolutely. But dwelling on what should have been doesn't change what was. What matters is that we did our jobs with excellence and integrity. We know what we accomplished. The men we saved know even if they don't know our names. That has to be enough. The technical legacy of James's innovation lived on in ways he never fully realized. The controlled stall-turn concept influenced the development of post-stall maneuverability research in the 1960s and 70s. Engineers studying advanced fighter aircraft examined historical accounts of pilots controlling their aircraft beyond normal stall speeds. James's combat camera footage from March 19, 1945, archived at Maxwell Air Force Base in Alabama, became a reference point for aeronautical engineers studying dynamic flight regimes. The principle that aircraft could be controllable beyond conventional stall speeds eventually contributed to the development of thrust vectoring and supermaneuverability in modern fighters. In 2007, the Air Force officially recognized the contributions of the Red Tails by awarding the Congressional Gold Medal collectively to all the pilots and support personnel of the fighter groups. James attended the ceremony in Washington, along with several dozen other surviving veterans. They stood on the steps of the Capitol, elderly men who'd been young warriors 62 years earlier, and received belated but genuine recognition. President George W. Bush spoke about their achievements, their courage, and their role in breaking down barriers. James shook the president's hand, accepted his medal, and felt a sense of closure that had been absent for decades. James passed away in 2012 at age 89. His funeral was attended by family, friends, fellow veterans, and representatives from the Air Force. An honor guard performed military honors, folding an American flag with precise practiced movements and presenting it to his widow. 3 fighter aircraft, modern F-16 Fighting Falcons, performed a missing man formation overhead, one aircraft pulling up and away in the traditional tribute to a fallen pilot. Bobby Washington delivered the eulogy, his voice strong despite his own advanced age. He spoke about courage, innovation, and excellence in the face of doubt and discrimination. The historical record eventually caught up with James's story, though it took time. Aviation historians, particularly those studying the Red Tails and the evolution of fighter tactics, recognized his contribution to aerial combat doctrine. Technical papers analyzed the stall-turn technique he'd pioneered and its influence on subsequent fighter development. Museums dedicated to African American military history included displays about his innovations. The Air Force added his story to its official educational materials about tactical innovation and the importance of diverse perspectives in military planning. The 9 jets that James encountered on March 19, 1945, represented Germany's last desperate attempt to regain air superiority through technology. The pilots flying those jets were skilled professionals, many of them veterans of years of combat. They'd been trained in the newest techniques, equipped with the most advanced aircraft their country could produce, and sent out with orders to stop the relentless Allied bombing campaign. They'd encountered an enemy pilot who refused to follow the expected script, who used tactics they'd never seen, who turned their technological advantage into a tactical puzzle they couldn't solve quickly enough. 3 of those jets had been driven from the engagement, mission killed, even if not destroyed. The remaining 6 had been frustrated and ultimately forced to withdraw without achieving their objective. The bomber crews they'd been trying to destroy had continued to their target, dropped their weapons on German industrial facilities, and returned safely to base. The industrial complex near Munich that they'd struck that day suffered significant damage, reducing production of optical equipment by an estimated 38% for several weeks. That reduction rippled through the German war effort in small but cumulative ways. Tank gun sights delivered late, submarine periscopes not manufactured, aircraft gun sights in short supply. The mission James had protected achieved its strategic objective, contributing one more piece to the vast accumulated weight that eventually crushed Germany's ability to continue the conflict. The bombers represented American industrial capacity made manifest, massive aircraft, produced by the thousands, filled with sophisticated equipment, flown by well-trained crews, supported by extensive logistics networks. Each B-17 Flying Fortress required approximately 400,000 man-hours to build. The engines, the propellers, the hydraulic systems, the electrical systems, the defensive armament, the bomb sight, all represented countless hours of engineering and manufacturing labor. The United States had built 12,731 B-17 bombers during the war, an impossible number that spoke to industrial capacity no other nation could match. But industrial capacity alone didn't win battles. The bombers needed protection, and protection came from skilled pilots in fighter aircraft. Those pilots needed training, and training needed to incorporate both established doctrine and innovative thinking. James Carter had embodied the innovative thinking that complemented industrial strength. His willingness to question conventional wisdom, experiment with unconventional techniques, and risk everything in actual combat had created tactical options that hadn't existed before. The combination of massive industrial production and individual tactical innovation created an asymmetric advantage that even Germany's technological achievements couldn't overcome. The social dimension of James's story remained its most painful aspect. A nation fighting a global conflict against regimes that explicitly embraced racial theories of superiority had maintained its own system of racial discrimination. Black pilots had been segregated, doubted, and systematically denied opportunities for advancement and recognition. They'd been forced to prove themselves repeatedly under standards more demanding than those applied to white pilots. They'd succeeded brilliantly, accumulated exceptional records, and demonstrated that skill and courage had nothing to do with skin color. Yet they'd returned home to face continued discrimination, limited opportunities, and the erasure of their contributions from mainstream historical narratives. The irony was profound and bitter. James and his fellow Redtails had protected bomber crews who might have been uncomfortable sitting next to them at a lunch counter. They'd fought for a country that legally barred them from many hotels, restaurants, and schools. They'd defended freedom while being denied full citizenship rights. They'd demonstrated excellence while being told they were inferior. The cognitive dissonance must have been staggering, yet they'd persevered, maintained their dignity, and fulfilled their duties with distinction. The delayed recognition came too late for many Redtails pilots who'd passed away before their contributions were properly acknowledged. Dozens of men who'd flown combat missions, achieved aerial victories, and protected countless bombers died without ever receiving appropriate recognition. Their families kept their stories alive in private, passing down knowledge of their service and achievements. But public recognition, historical acknowledgement, and societal appreciation came generations after the facts, when most of the participants were gone. James had been fortunate to live long enough to see some recognition, though he'd consistently deflected credit to his fellow pilots and support personnel. He'd emphasized repeatedly that combat success was never about individual heroics, but about teamwork, training, and collective discipline. The Outturned technique he'd developed had only been possible because of excellent training received at Tuskegee, the high-quality aircraft provided by American industry, the skilled maintenance performed by ground crews, and the courage of his wingmen who'd trusted him enough to follow him into unconventional tactics. The technique itself eventually became a historical footnote in the evolution of fighter tactics. Modern jet fighters with advanced flight control systems could perform maneuvers that James's Mustang could barely accomplish in controlled stalls. Computer-controlled fly-by-wire systems allowed contemporary pilots to operate throughout the entire flight envelope without fear of unrecoverable departures from controlled flight. The specific need for manually controlled stall turns disappeared as technology advanced. But the principle behind James's innovation remained relevant: the willingness to question conventional wisdom, explore the edge of the possible, and find creative solutions to tactical problems. Fighter pilots in the 21st century still studied historical accounts of aerial combat, including engagements like the one on March 19, 1945. They analyzed tactics, studied decision-making under pressure, and learned from examples of innovation and courage. James Carter's name appeared in technical histories and academic studies of fighter tactics, though rarely in popular accounts. Specialists knew his story. enthusiasts researched his contributions, but the general public remained largely unaware that a black fighter pilot from Alabama had developed tactics that influenced the outcome of aerial engagements in the closing months of World War II in Europe. The broader lessons of the story extended beyond military tactics and aviation history. James's experience illustrated how institutional discrimination could waste human potential by denying opportunities based on irrelevant characteristics. How many other innovations had never emerged because talented individuals were excluded from positions where they could contribute? How many problems had gone unsolved because the people most capable of solving them were barred from participation? The economic and social costs of systematic discrimination were incalculable, but certainly massive. James had succeeded despite the barriers placed in his path, but how many others with equal potential had been prevented from making their contributions? The story also illustrated the power of individual agency within institutional constraints. James couldn't change the discriminatory system he operated within, but he could control his own actions and decisions. He'd chosen excellence, innovation, and service despite facing doubt and discrimination. He'd maintained his integrity and dignity in circumstances that would have justified bitterness and resignation. His choices had mattered, had saved lives, had influenced outcomes. Individual agency couldn't overcome structural injustice alone, but it could create incremental change and preserve human dignity in the face of dehumanizing systems. The impact on the bomber crews James protected rippled forward through generations. Captain Frank Morrison's 4 children had children of their own, creating a network of descendants that by 2012 numbered in the dozens. Those people existed because Morrison had survived the war, and Morrison had survived partly because a fighter pilot he never met had placed himself between Morrison's aircraft and an enemy jet. Similar stories repeated across hundreds of bomber crewmen whose lives were protected by Red Tail's pilots. The invisible chain of causation connected thousands of present-day individuals to decisions made in split seconds over the skies of Germany in 1945. The physical artifacts of that March day mostly disappeared. James's Mustang, tail number 419173, had been scrapped after the war as surplus equipment. Of the nearly 15,000 Mustangs built during the conflict, only a few hundred survived into the 21st century, mostly in museums or private collections. The jets James had engaged were even rarer. The Me-262 had been produced in small numbers and most had been lost or destroyed. A few survived in museums, silent testimony to Germany's advanced aeronautical engineering and the ultimate inadequacy of technological innovation without supporting industrial capacity and strategic resources. But the memory persisted, carried forward by people who understood its importance. Veterans organizations, military historians, aviation enthusiasts, and educators worked to document and preserve the full story of the Red Tails. Books were written, documentaries produced, and memorials erected. The Tuskegee Airmen National Historic Site in Alabama became a repository for artifacts and archives. The National Museum of the United States Air Force in Ohio created extensive exhibits. Younger generations learned about the pilots who'd proven that skill and courage knew no color boundaries. The tactical innovation James pioneered found its place in the historical record as well. Aviation historians studying the evolution of fighter combat recognized the controlled stall turn as a significant development in tactics for addressing asymmetric aircraft performance. It appeared in technical analyses of piston engine versus jet engine engagements, in studies of defensive tactics against superior performance opponents, and in examinations of how individual pilot innovation influenced tactical doctrine. The technique was studied, analyzed, and understood as one piece of the complex puzzle of aerial warfare. James's children and grandchildren carried forward his values of excellence, service, and innovation. They pursued education, achieved success in various fields, and maintained awareness of the legacy they'd inherited. They attended commemorations, spoke to school groups, and worked to ensure their father's and grandfather's story remained part of the historical record. They understood that his significance extended beyond personal achievement to represent collective accomplishment by all the Red Tails pilots and the broader struggle for civil rights and equality. The German pilots who'd engaged James that day had their own complex experiences. Some survived the conflict, some did not. Those who survived returned to a defeated country, a divided nation, and the difficult process of rebuilding lives and society after total devastation. Some eventually immigrated to other countries, including the United States. A few even joined NATO air forces during the Cold War, flying alongside former enemies in defense against the emerging threat from the East. The ironies and contradictions of history created strange fellowships and unexpected alliances. The technical analysis of jet versus piston engagements continued for years after the conflict ended. Military analysts studied combat reports, examined gun camera footage, and interviewed surviving pilots from both sides. They developed understanding of why the jets, despite their clear performance advantages, had not achieved decisive superiority. Part of the answer lay in numbers. There were simply too few jets to affect the overall air campaign. Part lay in operational limitations. The jets had short range and limited endurance. But part also lay in tactical adaptations by Allied pilots, including innovations like James's controlled stall turn that created difficulties for jet pilots expecting easy victories. The broader air campaign over Europe had been won by accumulation rather than dramatic moments. Month after month, thousands of bombers had struck German industry, infrastructure, and military facilities. Thousands of fighter pilots had protected those bombers, engaged enemy aircraft, and gradually achieved air superiority through attrition and perseverance. Individual engagements like the one on March 19th mattered, but they mattered as part of a vast collective effort involving hundreds of thousands of people in thousands of missions over years of sustained operations. But within that vast collective effort, individual moments of courage and innovation created ripples that extended far beyond immediate tactical outcomes. James Carter's willingness to risk everything on an unconventional technique had saved lives that day, influenced tactical doctrine for months afterward, and provided an example of creative problem-solving under extreme pressure. The ripples from that single engagement extended through time in ways James himself could never fully measure or appreciate. The essence of his achievement lay not in the specific tactical maneuver, but in the mindset that created it. James had questioned conventional wisdom without rejecting it entirely. He'd respected established doctrine while recognizing its limitations. He'd prepared himself through study and practice so that when the moment came, he could act effectively. He'd maintained the discipline to execute precise maneuvers under life-threatening stress. He'd balanced aggression with judgment, innovation with responsibility. Those qualities, more than any specific technique, defined what made him exceptional. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.